Why do they not see what's happening?
That's how people get pulled into things. Did you read it?
Why does it feel like something is chasing us through reality itself?
Why does the city look like it already knows where we're going?
Why does every road become a mirror when consciousness starts waking up?
Why are the reflections moving before we do?
Why does one of them look frightened of us?
Why do mirrors panic when the observer remembers itself? Why did they ignore the theorem for decades?
Why are humans terrified of ideas that remove death?
Why would a civilization built on endings How could consciousness witness its own non-existence?
How could the observer report its own disappearance?
How can silence describe itself after the listener is gone?
Why does it feel like we already fell somewhere else?
Why do I feel another version of us didn't survive?
Why do surviving timelines feel haunted by the ones that ended?
Did Everett realize what he discovered?
Did he understand how dangerous the idea was?
Did the equation reveal that reality never chooses only one path? Are all these paths real?
Are we already walking through different lives?
Does the universe split every time observation occurs? How can the observer only continue where survival remains possible?
Why does the mind reject that possibility instantly?
Is the witness older than the body?
Is the self deeper than memory?
Was the observer called eternal long before physics rediscovered it? Why are the reflections delayed?
Why does one version of me stay still?
Why does consciousness leave echoes between timelines?
How did Neville describe the same structure before the mathematics existed?
How could assumption shape reality?
How could feeling become the trigger that selects experience?
What existed before my name?
What existed before memory?
What existed before the world appeared around you? Why does this idea terrify me?
Why does my chest tighten hearing it?
Why does the scaffold panic when it learns it was never the house?
Did we already die somewhere?
Did consciousness move before impact?
Did observation anchor itself where continuity remained possible?
Why does everything feel slightly wrong now?
Why do colors feel unfamiliar?
Why do survivors sometimes wake inside almost identical worlds? Why do millions remember things differently?
Why do false memories feel emotionally real?
Why do abandoned timelines leave fingerprints behind? Why do I remember places that never existed?
Why do lost lives feel emotionally nearby?
Why does memory sometimes bleed across probability? Why does this truth feel unbearable?
Why does awakening resemble fear first?
Why does the ego interpret freedom as death? Is this collapse?
Or is it transformation?
Can dismantling feel identical to destruction before recognition arrives? What happens if we stop resisting?
What happens if we cooperate with the mechanism?
What happens when the observer consciously chooses its state? Does reality respond to sustained feeling?
Does assumption alter the branch we inhabit?
Does consciousness anchor itself where its dominant state already exists? Why does wanting keep things far away?
Why does lack reproduce itself? Why does consciousness continue selecting separation when...
What changes when the feeling becomes present?
What changes when the wish feels fulfilled?
What changes when observation receives presence instead of... Did the world just change?
Or did we shift into another configuration?
Was reality always reorganizing around sustained observation? Is consciousness the real engine?
Is the body only an interface?
Is reality reacting to attention every second unnoticed?
Why does running feel like escaping old identities?
Why does speed feel like awakening?
Why does movement reveal what still clings to the past?
Why do new mirrors keep appearing?
Why does reflection feel important?
Why does reality itself behave like consciousness observing consciousness? Which one is really me?
Which version survives?
Was the observer ever limited to one form? Why is everything quiet now?
Why does the fear feel distant?
Does recognition produce silence where panic once lived? Was the universe ever hostile?
Or was it always responding?
Did consciousness mistake inertia for imprisonment? Have we always known this?
Did we forget on purpose?
Did incarnation require temporary amnesia? Why do thoughts feel magnetic?
Why do emotions reshape perception?
Why does sustained inner state become external architecture? Which path are we on?
Can timelines merge again?
Is observation continuously selecting the next scene? Why does reality look unstable?
Why does the world react to our awareness?
Why does the dream tremble when the dreamer awakens? Why did I spend so long afraid?
Why did survival become identity?
Why did the mask forget it was temporary? Can attention really change destiny?
Can assumption redirect reality?
Can consciousness consciously steer the branch it inhabits? Why does this feel familiar?
Why does truth feel remembered instead of learned?
Why does the observer recognize itself instantly? What exists beyond identity?
What remains without history?
What remains when every temporary label falls away? Can consciousness actually end?
Can the witness disappear? How can the observer observe its own absence if absence removes observation itself?
Did we leave reality?
Or did reality leave its old shape?
Was the transformation internal before it appeared external? Was I ever only human?
Was consciousness always larger than form? Was identity only a temporalization of awareness?
Why do humans repeat the same suffering?
Why do patterns continue across generations?
Why does unconscious attention recreate identical branches repeatedly?
What happens if I stop reacting?
What happens if stillness replaces fear?
What happens when the observer ceases identifying? Was I always the center of observation?
Was reality forming around awareness?
Was consciousness never inside the universe but... Is this death?
Or awakening?
Was the door feared only because the ego believed it was the end? What survives beyond the body?
What survives beyond memory?
What survives beyond every changing form? Was the observer ever in danger?
Was fear only misidentification?
Was consciousness always untouched beneath the entire performance? What is sovereignty really?
Is it power over reality?
Or is it recognition that reality already responds continuously to observation? Why am I no longer afraid?
Why does silence feel alive? Why does recognition end the war the ego spent lifetimes fighting?
Were we ever truly lost?
Were we always being guided toward remembrance?
Was the observer eternal long before the body?